Let's take the herbivore's perspective for just a little bit. It seemed like, from what I was saying before, that the herbivores have the whole world of things that they can eat. But it turns out that a lot of their food is defended. Grass has silica in it. Oak has tannins, a group of compounds that make proteins hard to digest. Milkweeds and lots of other plants have these toxic chemicals in them that are delivered in latex. The latex gums up their mouth parts and is loaded with a bunch of toxins that stop the channels and cells and really can cause some serious side effects. So plants are pretty defended. On top of that, if you're a grasshopper, you're delicious to this bird or to this parasitoid or to this spider. So if you're an herbivore, life is actually not as good as having food everywhere and readily available. You've got cruddy food to eat, and all sorts of predators want to eat you. You're sort of stuck between the devil and the deep blue sea, or the frying pan and the fire. Plants don't just sit there and wait to be eaten. In fact, evolution, caused by the evolutionary pressure of herbivores, has led plants to develop defenses. Here's an example of a monarch caterpillar eating a well-defended milkweed leaf. Milkweeds are eaten by very, very few insects, but one of the insects that can eat it is these monarchs. Monarchs, in fact, eat nothing but milkweed, which is a really well-defended plant. But if you look at a milkweed that has its defenses left intact versus has its defenses lowered, you see a reduction of 20% in the growth rate of this caterpillar. That's the only thing that it eats, but if you allow that plant to defend itself, it makes the caterpillar grow even slower. And if the caterpillar takes a longer time to grow, that means it's exposed to predators for a longer period of time. The plant can really have a negative impact on the herbivore. So plants are defended. They don't just sit there and wait to be eaten. They grow thorns and spines, some species, and cacti have all these spines that make them defended against herbivores or idiots that might want to sit on them. Plants also have the ability to regrow after they've been consumed. Here we have a plant that's resistant, that's got chemicals in it that make it yucky to herbivores. Here's a plant that's tolerant. It can grow really well even though these herbivores are eating it. Here's a plant that is susceptible. It doesn't grow as well as these others do when these insects are chewing on it. Let's talk about that last category just a little bit more, this idea of plant tolerance. So some plants are able to tolerate a certain amount of herbivory and not have their fitness be impacted. That's not really the case for plant species A here. If we imagine that this particular plant or this group of plants gets eaten a little bit, its fitness is fairly high. Gets eaten a little bit more, its fitness declines. Gets eaten a little bit more, its fitness really declines. So lineage A, whether that's a genotype, a family, a kind of plant, whatever, it's relatively sensitive to being eaten by herbivores. Plant group B is a little more tolerant. It can handle higher levels of damage with the sort of less amount of fitness reduction. In other words, for the same amount of damage, A is more sensitive. Its fitness drops a lot more than does the fitness for B. B is relatively more tolerant of herbivory than is A. Both of these, though, would be somewhat intolerant because as damage increases, the fitness declines. There are some kind of plants out there that the damage can be very, very high and there's no impact of fitness at all. In fact, the plant just sort of shrugs it off. They're very tolerant. For example, soybeans, it's thought that they can grow out in a field and be damaged up to 60% of the leaf area is lost, and the fitness, the yield in soybeans, is not changed at all. Even more bizarre is that there are some plants that actually do better the more damage they get. An example of this is a plant that after it gets damaged a little bit, it grows more and more stalks, and these stalks have flowers on them, and the more flowers they have, the more seeds they can make. So up until a certain point, increasing damage actually increases the fitness or seed production of some kinds of plants. It's a really weird exceptional case, but both C and D would be considered tolerant species. So it's certainly possible for the herbivores to have a negative impact on plant fitness, and this is typically what we see. But there are also cases where the plant actually has increased fitness the more it gets eaten. And here, not only would the herbivores act like either predators or parasites, but there can be examples of herbivores acting like mutualists, which is a strange thought. So let's talk a little bit more about some of the defenses that plants have. They can have these little hairs or spines or little grappling hooks on the surface of them that are called trichomes. These little hairs inhibit the ability of herbivores, especially small herbivores, to be able to chew on those leaves. But some plants have trichomes that are effective against larger herbivores. This is a close-up of a trichome of a plant called stinging nettle. Now, stinging nettle has these trichomes that embed in your leg, or if you're a deer, in your tongue, and then they break off, and then the liquid that's on the inside of this drains into your leg or your tongue or whatever it happens to be. And when this chemical gets embedded into your leg, it's really itchy, it really stings, it really burns, and people have found that it's a deterrent against larger herbivores. In fact, they've taken leaves of this stinging nettle plant and shaved all the trichomes off, and it turns out that deer eat those plants at substantially higher rates. So this tiny little microscopic trichome can be something that is a defense against large herbivores. Plants also make a large suite of chemicals that are deterrents against herbivores. This is an example of a very toxic plant called the wild parsnip. It makes a group of compounds known as furanocoumarins, and that's a term that I would like you to try to remember. These furanocoumarins, if they get applied to your skin, either intentionally or by accident, will make your skin blister like this. They blister, your skin blisters, when those chemicals are exposed to the sun. There's a kind of caterpillar that is able to eat those furanocoumarins and eat that plant tissue, but how it manages to do that is it makes a little web in the flower of the plant, and then it eats the stuff in the dark. So being in the dark a little bit helps that caterpillar to be able to tolerate these defenses. Now, two kinds of furanocoumarins are sphondin and xanthotoxin. It's not important to me that you remember those specific terms. But I do want you to recognize that this figure, maternal parent versus offspring mean value, this is reminiscent of something that we've done earlier in the class. Remember this idea of heritability? A parent-offspring regression helps us estimate the heritability, or the genetic component of that trait. And if we look at sphondin, that line is pretty strong. There's a pretty good relationship. Xanthotoxin, same thing. Parents that have low levels of xanthotoxin have offspring with low levels of xanthotoxin. Parents with high levels of xanthotoxin tend to have high levels offspring. So what happens is there's a genetic component to these traits. That genetic component, the value of the genetic component, changes. If there are no webworms, whether you've got that trait or not, you're not really benefited. But when there are webworms present, if you've got a lot of defense, the fitness of the plant is higher. So we'd be over here. If you've got a lot of defense, your fitness is higher when there are webworms. If you've got low levels of defense, then your fitness is low. So there's not only a genetic variation for that defense, it matters when there are herbivores around. So plants make a whole bunch of different kinds of defensive chemicals, and humans benefit quite a bit from all these defensive chemicals. Many of them are made into medicines that we use, including things like aspirin, which was originally developed and extracted from the black willow plant, caffeine and nicotine, which are compounds that come from two different kinds of cultivated plants. They're produced in those plants as defensive compounds, but we benefit from them when we recognize that they're useful to us, and then we also grow those plants and cultivate them. This is a poison ivy plant, and it produces this compound known as urushiol. Urushiol is a compound that makes many of us itch if we get that embedded in our skin, and it's a very effective herbivore deterrent. Spicy peppers have a compound in them known as capsaicin. That's what makes your mouth burn when you eat spicy food, or one of the many compounds that can make your mouth burn when you eat spicy food. What's real interesting about this is that this is a very effective deterrent against mammals, but it does not deter birds. Birds don't have any sensors for detecting that capsaicin compound. But that's actually a good mutualism with the birds and the plants, because capsaicin is not effective against birds, but birds are really good seed dispersers for this plant. Mammals, when they eat these seeds or eat these fruits, they destroy the seeds and they kill the seeds. So it's kind of like the pepper plants have a targeted defense against the seed predators, but their defense doesn't work against their seed dispersers, the mutualist birds. People use lots of other different kinds of things that are plant defenses, not just the spiciness of peppers, but some of the supposedly hallucinogenic compounds in absinthe, the spices of black pepper, the tannins in wine. All of these things are things that they're defensive chemicals that people really enjoy, and we harvest and cultivate those plants using the chemical production, the chemical factories in the plants as something that produces a product that we like. I've said that there are lots of medicinal plants that have been used by humans over the years. One medicinal plant is erythroxylin coca. Now this is a plant that occurs in South America, and it's something that the local people there chew whole leaves of, and is a real nice pain reliever, and also gives you a little bit of extra energy. Now when it's processed and ingested in different ways and concentrated in the form of cocaine, it can of course be highly addictive and even highly deadly. Erythroxylin coca was originally a compound that was incorporated into early recipes for Coca-Cola. In fact, the reason why it's called Coca-Cola is because it used to have erythroxylin coca in it. So it had a really nice stimulating effect, I would imagine. Besides the caffeine that's in there, it would also have a little bit of cocaine. This is another example of medicines or drugs that we get from plants. This is an opium poppy. Here's an opium poppy whose fruit has been sliced, and what happens is this latex comes out. That's where all the opiates are concentrated. They get harvested from here and then transformed either into morphine or codeine or lots of other different kinds of opioids. Now, heroin was a drug that was originally synthesized in the late 1800s as a way to avoid people from getting morphine addiction. Lots and lots of people were addicted to morphine then, as some are now, and the heroin drug was supposed to be the hero drug. It was a hero drug because it was supposed to be just as an effective painkiller but far less addictive. Well, sort of backfired. It turned out that heroin became a much more addictive compound, about 15 to 30 times more addictive than morphine, and of course lots and lots of people have died from heroin overdose. I need to say something just a little bit about the endings of these words. Now, morphine, codeine, if you think about caffeine and nicotine, they all end in -ine. The reason for that is because they're all alkaloids. Alkaloids is a class of compounds that contain nitrogen. They're often bitter, and so they often have a very bitter taste to them, and they are typically very effective on people at very low doses. So that's one class of compounds worth remembering, the alkaloids. Another class of compounds that plants produce are steroids. Now some of these steroids are compounds that we have used for medicinal purposes. Cortisone and other steroids have been used for treating itching, for helping healing, for helping in muscle development, etc. But there are also a group of steroids that were originally isolated in plants called wild yams that have been used for birth control in humans. Original birth control medication was extracts of wild yam. Now you can imagine that as a plant defense compound, this could be pretty useful for mammals. So you're a wild yam plant, and mammals come along and keep eating you. It would be pretty awesome if you could give them a drug that basically made it so that they could not get pregnant and have offspring, right? So that's the idea behind these particular groups of steroids in at least wild yams. I want to jump back to alkaloids for just a second. People have used these plant defense compounds in lots and lots of ways. In the news recently, there's a compound called chloroquine or hydrochloroquine, and these compounds are related to quinine. Now these compounds are typically or have been used for keeping people safe from malaria. Here we have some soldiers in a place where malaria was really high in abundance, and so they had to take their daily or weekly dosage of quinine. Now I have a story that I've made up about this particular picture. These two guys are officers. They are making all of the enlisted men take the quinine straight, 5 grains of it. Remember I said it was really, really bitter. These compounds, if they're alkaloids like quinine, if they're alkaloids, they're going to be pretty bitter, and probably is a pretty miserable experience to just take the quinine straight. So why are these guys smiling? Well, plants have not only kept us safe and have not only been medicinals, but they've also influenced our culture. I propose that the reason why these two guys were smiling, this is the story I'm making up, is because they had their gin and tonic, and that's how they dosed themselves with quinine. Tonic water has quinine in it. It gives tonic water a particular taste that makes it unique. That taste goes really well with gin, and when the British invented gin and tonics, that invention happened in the tropics in places where people were flavoring their water with quinine. So culturally, we've been impacted by the development of these plant defense compounds as well. I want to end with a little bit of information about other ways that these plant defense compounds can influence your life. So you might have heard that sometimes you get a warning to not take grapefruit juice with your medicine. So why might that be? Some drugs, many drugs, are neutralized by these compounds called cytochrome P450 enzymes. It's a good thing to remember cytochrome P450 enzymes. You will come across this term a lot more in the future. Cytochrome P450s break down toxins in your system, and when they find these things, they neutralize them, and that saves you a bunch. Grapefruit contains bergamottin. Incidentally, that's a kind of furanocoumarin that we mentioned before. It's not the same kind as what we've discussed before, but it's in the class of compounds known as furanocoumarins. And bergamottin blocks cytochrome P450 activity. So why might that be a bad thing for you if you're taking medicine and washing it down with a big glass of grapefruit juice, or if you're eating a grapefruit? So here's the issue. If you are a grapefruit tree, then you've got herbivores eating you. You have defense compounds that you've used, and it's been effective for a while, but the herbivore that has been eating your plant tissues is now able to neutralize those defense compounds that you've made. But you've got another trick up your sleeve if you're this grapefruit tree. What you've done is you've invented bergamottin. Bergamottin isolates and blocks the ability of that herbivore to neutralize your defense compounds, and so it's basically giving the herbivore a double whammy. The defense compound plus a way of neutralizing the herbivore's ability to neutralize the defense compound, which means that the herbivore is now susceptible to the defenses again. Why might this be a problem for you? So imagine that when you take this medicine, you've got a particular dose. That dose has been determined based on your body weight and other factors, but also it's been determined by how much your body is naturally going to break that down. So let's imagine that the dosage that you take is actually predicated upon the assumption that your body's going to break down 50% of that pill, and that what you'll actually get delivered to your system is only 50% of the actual dosage. But if you take your medicine with bergamottin, what's going to happen? What's going to happen is you're not going to break down 50% of it. You're going to get a double dose of what that medicine is. So that can be really problematic. Now, not all medicines are neutralized by the enzymes that are blocked by bergamottin. So this is a small class of compounds, but caffeine, some antidepressants, a few other kinds of medicines, look very carefully on the label. Here's the reason why you should not take some of those medicines with grapefruit juice. So if we're thinking about evolutionary pressures, producing defense compounds is a pretty cool trick that plants have. Even producing other compounds that neutralize the defenses of their herbivores is another pretty cool trick. But plants also have an ability to ramp up their defenses or save their costs of producing those defenses in other times. If you think about it, the physical and chemical defenses that plants make are costly to produce. And wouldn't it be better if you didn't have to pay the cost of making those defenses? Well, plants have two different kinds of defense systems, much the same way that you have multiple defense systems in your body. So imagine that you're a plant and you're not being eaten by anything, time is going on, and so you've got kind of a background low level of defense. You are defending yourself some, sort of like the way your skin defends you from infection. But now let's say that you get attacked. You're a plant and you're getting eaten by an herbivore, or you're a person and you've got a bacteria that's been introduced into your system. Well, what's going to happen if you're a plant is you ramp up very quickly the level of defense compounds. And this group of plant compounds, or the way that the plant responds, is called its induced defense. The constitutive defense is the background that's sort of always on if you're not being impacted by an herbivore, but the induced defense is one that ramps up in response to attack. In the example of you getting a bacterial infection, you get the bacterial infection and now your immune system charges ahead and attacks those bacteria. You have an induced response, but you also have constitutive defenses as well. Here's an example of a physical defense that's been induced. A plant called the acacia in Africa, if it gets fenced so that no herbivores can come along and eat it, any new branches that are produced have shorter thorns. These thorns are expensive to make, and so new branches, when there's been no herbivores, tend to have short thorns. When you then remove those fences and allow herbivores to come in and consume them, new branches produce longer thorns, which of course are deterrents to herbivores. So that's a physical defense that can be both constitutive and induced, but plants, remember, produce a lot of chemicals. This is an example from a study that I did several years ago looking at two different kinds of plants. We've got Baptisia alba and Baptisia australis. Baptisia alba, as it gets more and more damage, increases its level of alkaloids a little bit, but Baptisia australis, as it gets more and more damage, the percentage of alkaloids in its leaf really increases. So plants have the ability to get induced both in terms of physical defenses and in chemical defenses. One last thing, they can also bring in the mob to defend them. So imagine you're this plant and you've got an herbivore eating you. You can produce more chemicals within your leaf, but what some plants do is they also release these volatile chemicals that turn out to be a signal for these predators. Actually, these are parasitoids, but they act like predators in that they come along and they lay eggs in the caterpillar. Those eggs, remember before when we talked about parasitoids, those eggs hatch and then they eat the caterpillar from the inside out, and then they ultimately kill the caterpillar. So plants have the ability to recruit predators, parasitoids, etc., to help them attack these guys. So this is a good example of the enemy of my enemy is my friend.